Be the principal. Vichu.
As you know, the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare is a research-based policy advisory body, and we believe in research-based policy advice. And we do policy-oriented research. It is in this context, for last 18 months, we have been inviting scholars and best minds from across the world, both India and abroad. And we have also had the privilege of two Nobel laureates. And we have tried to maintain a balance between scholars from within our country and scholars from outside. We have been very fortunate that we have had the best minds speak to us on contemporary issues. We are recovering from the COVID. In the post-COVID recovery, it is obvious that we will be discussing about the growth trajectory of our country. And because COVID has been a big reset across the world, we want to discuss about growth and the strategy to achieve growth. To do so, we have invited Dr. Arvind Virmani, who's also the chairman of EGROW Foundation, to come and speak to us about growth, past, present, and future. The Prime Minister has been talking about India 2047, and we thought this will be the perfect time to speak and discuss this issue at length. Dr. Arvind Virmani has been the chief economic advisor of our country and also the executive director at the IMF. He has completed his PhD from Harvard University and is published extensively, even in peer-reviewed journals and books. I must, before we invite him, give you some details about the path that Dr. Arvind Virmani charted. He was in the World Bank Development Policy Division from 1980 onwards, where he worked on important issues like credit policy, financial sector, natural resources covering mining, and tax reforms, including direct taxes like income tax and value-added tax. In 1987, he was invited and he joined the Planning Commission, and a special division was created, the Development Policy Division. Very different from the programs, the Development Policy Division was created in the Planning Commission. The focus was on how to start reforms. Please remember that that's the time when Rajiv Gandhi had taken over and the thought of reforms and changes in policy had already begun. Dr. Virmani was specially brought in to write on reforms and to talk to other policymakers, convince them, write general papers on what should be the structure of reforms, how should we face the reforms. Now, people like me remember very clearly that was a deep licensing Raj that India was in. And we had started with the socialist pattern of the economy, and now we are trying to open and look at reforms which can open the economy. It was not very easy. And that is why in the special division of development policy in the Planning Commission, these things were being thought and discussed, and papers written on how to really walk the talk and bring in the reforms. The first phase reforms, as we all know, started after 1990. So Dr. Virmani joined in 1991 Ministry of Finance, and that is where reforms were being driven. And then what were the major issues that the economy was facing? And I used to be at the Reserve Bank at that point of time. And in the Reserve Bank, while we were doing financial sector reforms, over this side, in the Ministry of Finance, Dr. Arvind Virmani was working on very special issues. I happened to also be in the Division of International Trade, and we were watching it as to what is happening in Delhi. Exchange rate was a very big issue. And so he worked on the exchange rate policy, thought about the dual exchange rate so that transition is soft and smooth before we do the complete exchange rate normalization or market determination. RBI did most of the job because exchange rate falls in that place. But the policy issues were being discussed in Delhi, and Dr. Arvind Virmani was instrumental in preparing those notes and these concept papers, which were being policy oriented and discussion oriented. That time, trade reforms were must. There were huge tariff walls in the country, and the trade reforms involved, and I used to work on those trade issues and import duties. And the important issue was you have to protect your domestic industry. And I don't know, the infant industry argument, which started in early 60s, continued. The infant industry never became an adult industry. And I used to sit in the RBI and look at the duty structure, way heavier than rest of the world. And so he started working on trade reforms, where he started suggesting about reducing the tariffs, but not immediately, over a period of time, gradually, so that the economy is able to adjust, the industry is able to adjust. In tariff reforms, many things were involved. There was strategy that was involved, and that strategy had to be implemented not in a single budget, but over a period of 8 to 10 budgets, gradually reducing the duties and then ensuring that we are at a level which is globally competitive. There's another issue that's very important in the tariffs. You had to make sure, and we have all seen it happening in GST now, and even yesterday and day before, you had to make sure that the tariff reduction is done in such a sequence, and that's why sequencing of reforms is very important. This is an illustration that they have to be done in a sequence while looking at groups of sectors, industries, in terms of intermediate industries, capital goods industries, consumer goods industries. So if there is not a proper sequencing, then those issues can come up and there can be a inverted curve. So you had to balance, firstly, within the same sector, you had to see that what's happening at the intermediate good and the capital good, and over the sectors, because there is so much of feedback from one sector to the other, that a balance is maintained. Obviously, and we are all aware now, but we are talking of 90s, the supply chain issues became very important. Otherwise, there will be inverted tax structure. And then that will be very disruptive for the economy. While you're removing the constraints in the economy, you have to also ensure that there is no confusion there. The other reform that he was associated in the Ministry of Finance was tax reforms. Now, we all remember there was a time in our country when the highest tax slab was 97%. That was the peak. But then that had to be gradually reduced, and it was reduced to about 30%, and this is 1997. So Dr. Virmani has been in the thick of in the Ministry of Finance, and then also looking at the macro aspects. And this is regarding abolition of capital controls, setting up of the SEBI. And I think what benefited him was his PhD thesis at Harvard was Kenneth Arrow. And therefore, he was trained to think in terms of a asymmetric information problem. So the moral hazard problem. So he's trained to think like that. And that is what helped him again, his training in PhD, talking about the abolition of capital controls and other institutional setup. So you're thinking of decontrol, you're also thinking of regulation. That's very important. The balance is very important. He was also associated with the new telecom policy of 2003, the Electricity Act of 2003, again, unbundling, if you all remember, that was the time when discoms were being discussed, and the generation of electricity and distribution of electricity and the pricing of electricity. That was also the time when once that idea was brought in of the state electricity boards, that their loans can be written off or given to the commercial banks, and they can take fresh loans from the World Bank. So he was in the Ministry of Finance while these thoughts were coming from the Planning Commission. He also worked on natural resources as well as the spectrum. By virtue of all the activities that he was involved and engaged in, he was a member of TRAI, the TRAI Telecom Regulatory Authority, and he is also representing DEA in LIC and UTI in Punjab National Bank and few other banks. So he has a complete spectrum of reforms as well as seeing how those reforms are playing out in the financial institutions and the financial markets. His research at that point of time was in various areas, and I was looking that he has worked, of course, in the Ministry of Finance on fiscal issues and exchange rate, which I've already mentioned, but then he also worked on government debt market, the FAMA, the New Foreign Exchange Management Act, which replaced the Foreign Exchange Regulatory Act. So, with this wide spectrum of experience in policy making and reforms, we invited him to come and speak to us about reforms in India, past, present, and future. We are looking forward to a scintillating talk today, a learning experience for all of us. Over to Dr. Virmani.
Thank you, Charan, for your kind comments and highlighting some of the many reforms that I was involved in to different degrees. You highlighted some of the ones which I kind of pushed or drove in a professional or technical sense. So with that, let me switch on my PowerPoint, and you can tell me if it is working properly. Yeah, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see them now.
Do you see the full screen or okay, now I can start it from the beginning. Yeah. Okay, is that fine?
Yes, perfect.
Oh, okay, that's it then, fine. Okay, so the topic as Dr. Charan Singh pointed out is economic reforms and growth, past, present and future. So it's because there's a big history, I think it's important to see current reform and future reforms in history. So I'm going to very briefly go through it. In principle, actually, I don't mind being interrupted in the middle, but perhaps we can wait. You can note down your questions, but if there is some serious elaboration, I can do. So basic point here is there are 5 phases of reforms and growth, separable by broad policy themes. However, one should keep in mind that all policies do not change at the same time. Some policies, each policy changes at different times, so we do a broad separation. That is the idea of phases. And the key point here, which Dr. Charan Singh also emphasized, the importance here is to understand the link between policy reform and growth, because that is what we are interested in for the future. We need to have good policies for the future, and that's a key reason for looking into this history. So this is a perspective based on policy research, and there's a reference right next to it. And maybe, of course, you will have this on YouTube, but maybe we can put this up also on our website so you can click to the links, because I don't think on YouTube you can click, but we can put this on. So based on policy research, a host of policy papers which are at that thing, and a numerous policy advice, some of which Dr. Charan Singh has highlighted. Okay, so let me start. Before I go into individual phases, what I have here on the left is a table which gives a overall perspective of these 5 phases in the international context. Okay, so this is some of the new work I'm doing right now in updating some of the data. And so what does this show? So this, when we measure and compare performance globally in an economic sense, we look at per capita GDP, not growth. Of course, in the common discourse and every day we all talk about growth, including myself. But when we judge performance, we look at per capita growth, because population growth is not under our control. That's a long-term thing. It's not affected by short-term or medium-term policy changes so much. Generally, of course, you can have a drastic program like the Chinese one where the growth collapses, but that is very rare. Okay, so what do I have here? So the P1, the first phase, which we'll go into detail, but Dr. Charan Singh has already told you, the socialist phase. And the important thing here is if you look at rows 3 and 4, it tells you that India was in the bottom 20% of growth in the world. So one has collected all the countries, ranked India in terms of the average growth during this period of 61 to 80, and India was in the bottom 20%. When we go to phase 2, second column, and then again look at rows 3 and 4 where the rank and percentage from top is given, we move to the top 20%. So it's interesting, many people don't recognize the very strong effect of phase 2. Everybody thinks that reforms really started in P3, which is 91, 92, which is the phase 3. But actually the effect of, and how, I'll tell you why that is so, but I just want to give you the overall picture and emphasize that phase 2 was very important. It took India from the bottom 20% to the top 20%. Then in phase 3, there were further improvement. Phase 3 is known as in India and across the world as the big reforms, which are discussed, which Dr. Charan Singh talked about my role in it also. But we just moved about 10 places up in the international ranking to come to within 15%. The number here is 12%, but don't take that to literally, this is rough of all the, this is the actual number, but you can say we moved from the top 20% to the top 15%. Now, this is the second interesting point which we see here. If you look at now the P4 column, there was actually no improvement in our ranking. And if you just take the numbers, we remained within 15%, and the number actually shows a deterioration. But again, these minor changes should not be taken too seriously. What we conclude is that there was little change in phase 4. So phase 4, note this, we will come back to it when we discuss all these phases and what was actually happening in the policy field. But this overview is important for getting a picture. So, and then we have phase 5, which started in 2014. So you can see on top, above the phases, you have the dates, if you want to look at the dates, 60 to 80, 81 to 90 P2, P3 from 92 to 2003, P4 from 2004 to 13, and then P5, which is not finished, which is still ongoing. So this you have to be a little careful, and I'll show you why. But here we moved considerably from 26th or 25th position to 10th position, which is in the top 5%. So our performance actually improved considerably if we take the average growth during this period and compare it with the average growth of all other countries in the world for which data is available in the WDI. I should mention that this is all WDI data, the latest update which happened in July and which I'm working on. And so I don't think anybody else has really used this updated data till now. So, so this is the overall picture. Now, and we'll come back to it right at the end. So next thing is, what are these phases? It's very important to understand if you're going to look at the phase. So as Dr. Charan Singh said, the first phase I actually call bureaucratic socialism. Let's not get into why, but the policy regime can roughly be thought of in two phases from 1950 to 60 and 61 to 80. Much of the worst policy moves actually happened in phase 1B, which is the data I have given you average when we were 20% bottom. And the professed goal was a mixed economy, but the reality was a whole jungle of controls on every aspect of the economy were created. Probably the worst control regime among any mixed or market economy in the world. Economic outcome. What was the economic outcome of this control regime? Our per capita GDP grew by about 1.2, 1.3%, and GDP about 3.4, 3.7%. I mean, it will be in the table. This one is in table 2. As I said, for purposes of international comparison and performance evaluation, we generally use per capita, but all the GDP figures you can see, and we can discuss also if you want later, but I'll focus on per capita GDP. So in this phase, as I've already shown in table 1, we were on bottom quintile, the bottom 20% of the countries. And here's the kicker, the poverty, all this was done for poverty, removing poverty and all that. We refused to become a market economy. We wanted to go socialism. And the whole objective was that we are very poor, okay? And therefore, we can't afford a market economy. Well, the poverty rate, if you look at the beginning to the end of the thing, it actually worsened from the beginning to end. This is not to say that there was no improvement through the whole period. Actually, it improved a bit and then went back. So the overall effect of this policy phase and the policy approach was to actually worsen poverty. But even worse, and this is the thing which we are still dealing with, the long-term damage was that tax evasion, corruption became a systemic problem. It seeped into every area of the economy. That is the long-lasting negative effect of this, besides, as I said, the actual macro things in GDP and poverty. So phase two, this is from 1980 to 1990. This is the kind of Rajiv Gandhi period which I mentioned, which Dr. Charan Singh mentioned actually, where, as he indicated, I was in the Planning Commission writing these papers, so kind of reforms was in the air. Some reforms were being done, and let's see what was actually achieved during that period. So very selective decontrol. It was like a pressure cooker. The Indian economy had been so badly suppressed and controlled during the bureaucratic socialism phase that even a little bit of reform kind of let off the what would you call them, the angels of growth or the growth spirits, and it was like a release of a pressure cooker. So there were some limited reforms in external trade, production capacity, liberalization, prices. It was very sectoral. It was very limited. It wasn't big bang of any sort, which we will see in phase three. And so the per capita growth rate increased to 2.9%. So this is 2.5 times what was there in P1, which, if you recall, I just said was about 1.25% roughly. So this is a more than doubling, 2.5 times that growth. So the pressure cooker was released. The animal spirits of the entrepreneurs were released. They were being suppressed, and you get this outpouring of growth. So growth rate, as I've already shown, and poverty begins to decline now. Instead of increasing, it is declining throughout this period. And just to mention one technical point here, there are papers which I have written on it, which in the first page reference which I gave. And one of the key things, because there were many, many reasons mentioned, what I found was econometrically the key driver of this growth was investment and productivity driven by capital goods imports. For people who are interested a little bit, I'll explain very quickly. During the socialist period, we kind of, our foreign exchange, our BOP worsened and worsened. So we put increasing controls on imports, but we had rupee trade with the Soviet Union. So capital goods imports from USSR were free. They were restricted from all over the world where the technology was improving. So we were stuck with this terrible old Soviet technology. So when we liberalized capital goods imports, there was a huge boom in productive investment. And this drove this enormous growth rate. There were, of course, many reasons which we can discuss, and those I've written about, but let's move on because we must get an overview of the whole situation. So when I said, if you recall again, that I said that this gives the overall trajectory, but there were certain policies which continued on the socialist trajectory, even in P2. This is another reason why people don't think of it as a reform phase. And they always mention, in fact, Dr. Charan Singh also mentioned, marginal income tax rate rose to 95%. And it was more than 100% if you include the wealth tax. So this is a fact often quoted. But there was also this pressure cooker release, so economic growth and macroeconomics is very contradictory. You've got to pick out the key factors. And I'm trying to give you a flavor of this also. So that was the thing, that there were certain things which continued on the old trajectory, but there was this release of selective decontrol, which actually had a very strong effect on growth and even income poverty. Okay, so this is the phase 3, which I categorize as the big liberalization, which everybody talks about. And I clump this together, and I'll give you an indicator of why. I've already given you an indicator that our position in this period was average, where we improved to 15%. So liberalization 91 to 2003, what was being done? So price and production and capacity controls on manufacturing were lifted rapidly. There was still a small percent, you could say, that maybe 10% was done in the previous phase, 80% was done in this phase, and then a trickle of things continued to happen later also. So this is what I said, different things moves, but I'm trying to give you a broad range picture on average. So the important reforms during this period. The other was internal trade. A lot of things like refinery products, diesel, petrol, fertilizer, sugar, many products were controlled. You couldn't trade them freely. They were controlled by the government. So these were liberalized. Investment, both private, domestic thing, there were controls on, as I said, capacity, but also on investment. So, and much more importantly, the foreign FDI, I put this in purple, was some of the reforms where I was more deeply involved. You can see that the purple will give you an idea, which Dr. Charan Singh has also mentioned. So foreign FDI, because there, the domestic part was under the control of Ministry of Industry. The FDI was within the DEA, within Ministry of Finance, where I was for most of this period. So capital markets, CCI abolition, right in the beginning. Then gradual liberalization of the foreign capital inflows, FII, ECB. We can discuss, we had a strategy. So basically the way it worked, and again, Dr. Charan Singh has given, I used to do the conception. I used to write a concept paper and give it to the Secretary DA, and based on that, and of course all other inputs which he got, then the thing would be passed on. Like we said, there's an ECB division there was, who would actually do the implementation. So lots of people involved. So my role was really in doing the economic conceptualization. External trade, QRs, tariff, minerals. Again, Dr. Charan Singh has given you a hint of that. Exchange rate, how we moved from dual rate to uniform to market driven to FEMA. So as I said, my key involvement was in the beginning phase, the dual rate and the FEMA. And if there are questions, we can go more deeply into it. Then this whole financial sector is, of course, was in the finance ministry. The policy was under the control of the ministry. In all implementation, as you all know, is with the RBI. As far as banks, equity markets, financial sector, even NBFCs, etc. So in the ministry, I wrote many notes, for example, on NBFCs reform, etc., etc. And the key point here, which again Dr. Charan Singh is pointing out, which we must remember, that this is a sector, this whole sector is characterized by asymmetric information and moral hazard. So it is very important to pay careful attention, not just to the decontrol, but the regulatory aspects, because without the regulatory aspects, you'll get monopolies and you'll get extraction of monopoly rents, which is not good for the general public. So one has to do these reforms very carefully, keeping both things in mind. So here we are. So the P3 reforms. Now, you all know that it just happens to be that different governments in P3A and P3B. So those first things which I've indicated were mostly happened before 99, before the change of government. And I wanted to also show what happened. There was a change in the government from 99, but the point here is not a political point, but just the timeline and what are the things. So one is in infrastructure. There was much greater conceptual clarity and reform on infrastructure during this B phase of P3, okay, the big reform. So conceptually, again, as I indicated, what I tried to do was to conceptualize it and make it more concrete. And then that was taken up by the reformer. I mean, it has to go up the chain and the reforms occur, and then the implementation is this thing. So I'm giving you an idea of the conceptualization. So public goods infrastructure versus private goods and infrastructure is a very key concept. Government monopoly, changing government monopoly in a phased manner to first bring in private competition and then try to withdraw the public sector. These things were all worked out during this period. And public goods infrastructure. So when there are things which are private goods infrastructure, which is in the fourth line here, like mobile telephony. So we made in my input into the telecom policy that mobile telephony is now private goods infrastructure. We can have competition in it, must be regulated because of these asymmetries and new thing, network externalities. Again, I'm not going to go into the details. We can do that in the questions, but to give you an overall idea. And so in public goods infrastructure, you have competition in constructions. Highways is public goods. Rural roads is public goods infrastructure. You can't have private competition, but you can have private competition in the construction of those infrastructure. So you've got this concept of PPP. Similarly, regulated entry, airports, ports, and electricity distribution are basically natural monopolies. So the concept we created was we must have regulated entry of private sector. So some airport, and though this word is not commonly used, but this is what my concept was of benchmark competition. So for example, you have 20 airports, just to take an example. 5 of them could be public, 15 could be to different people who run airports, and you can have benchmark them against each other. You can see how efficient X airport is versus other. So it's called benchmark competition because it's a natural monopoly. You can't have real competition, but you can have. So that was one concept. And similarly, in new telecom policy, as I mentioned already, the mobile telephony and the auctions was a very important factor here. Electricity Act, unbundling. Dr. Charan Singh has already picked this out and told you how the unbundling was the key. So once you unbundle, you can divide up, you can make production very competitive. Okay, but distribution is a natural monopoly which will have to be regulated, and then transmission, of course, has to be treated in a very different way itself. So the conceptualization and implementation of these things happened. A lot of the things which we mentioned happened during this B phase, P3B. So what was the result? So per capita average annual growth rate jumps to 4.4% in P3, which is now only 1.4 times the P2 growth rate of 2.9. So you can see already. And of course, we are now in the top 15%. That's an error. I should have put 15% of all countries here. And similarly, GDP growth rose to about 6% from 5.3%. So the outcome is top 15% and top 17%. As I said, sorry for that error on 20%. And poverty declined very rapidly with fast growth. That's the interesting part, more rapidly than the first one, because the first one was more of a pressure cooker. Okay, and this was beginning to push the frontiers. Okay? That is kind of the conceptual difference. Now you already see, and we'll see more of this, you see that you have to do more reforms, and as you get closer and closer to the frontier, you get less growth out of it. Okay, so here you have much bigger actual reforms than in phase 2, but you get a growth acceleration of only 40%. Okay, so interesting thing to keep in mind, which will have implications for future. So lessons from this research: lags between reforms and GDP acceleration, the EGROW of growth and productivity. Again, there's a paper which I wrote in the IMF, which you can see if you're interested more. And the basic idea is very simple. When you have major reforms, you can actually get a little bit of slower growth before the benefits of the reforms actually seep through the economy. And very careful phasing and sequencing is necessary to make sure that this downward path is small and the upward path happens as quickly. So phasing and sequencing is very important for us. So incremental effects I've already pointed out, decrease at higher rates because you get to the frontier. Again, we can elaborate in the Q&A if anybody is interested. And this is the key here, which I pointed out at the end of phase 4, but you need continuous reforms to maintain GDP growth at high level of 7 to 8. And we'll see more on this later. Next. Okay, so I've already read out some of these growth rates, but I just want to point out that in column 3, the per capita growth rate 1.2 to 2.9 to 4.0 to 5.3 to 5.6, and we'll discuss that when we go to the next phase. I just wanted to put this here, and we'll refer to this again. I've already given you a picture of that. So P4, so we come to 2004 to 13, and in a book by Pooja Mehra, it's called The Lost Decade. And this is a little complicated, so you have to be careful, and I'll show you what that actually means. People make wrong conclusions of this. Growth rate was actually sustained. I've already shown you twice. I showed you in the beginning that the ranking was good, but even the growth rate table, you can see the growth rate actually improved, but the ranking didn't. Okay, so in some sense, growth rate was sustained during this fourth phase of reform, the first part of which we call the last decade, but the growth was high. So the lagged effect, positive effects of J curve, which I referred to, very important. Okay, you can't look at just if you can't look at a 5-year period and say, oh, I did all these reforms, and it's true that sometimes the benefit comes 5 years later. So politically, again, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but the economists should understand that there can be lagged effects, and some of it is due to this J curve. So you get an initial decline, and as I said, there's papers I've shown how that happened in industries, but it's mixed. So we looked at 9 industries, out of which 3 of them show a J curve. 3 of them showed kind of very slow recovery, where no J curve effect statistically, and 3 of them actually started growing very fast right away. Okay, so it's mixed. But you do get J curve sometimes, and you have to be careful. You have to understand to be able to do this careful phrasing. So what was the problem in the last decade of 2004 to 13? Primacy to social goals, but no social sector reform. Okay, so giving primacy to social goals. So how did it express itself? It expressed itself basically in the form of more expenditures. So more expenditures on social sector. Without social sector reform, what we did was they forced the infrastructure, the public goods infrastructure that I referred to, was told to be financed by public sector banks. Wrong policy. And by the way, I'm not speaking in hindsight. The only time I publicly objected to a policy was forcing the use of foreign exchange reserves to finance infrastructure. That didn't happen, but they did force the PSBs. So basically, infrastructure loans, forced loans, electricity, all the infrastructure which we have referred to earlier, gave rise to this twin debt problem, which was the legacy on later. Fiscal looseness. The FRBM was good implementation. You have to credit this phase P4. There was FRBM reform right in the beginning, but from the previous phase 2-3 actually, but it got implemented from 2004. And the results you'll see again the lagged effects. The FRBM was passed or initiated and approved, etc. in 2003. That's the previous phase, and then suspended because of the GFC 8-9. Now, this suspension decision was not wrong. We needed the stimulus. I was the CEA. I wholeheartedly recommended a strategy. Again, I don't want to go into that. But in 2010, after I retired, it was completely abandoned when there was no need to abandon it. Okay, we should have gone back to it. In fact, I said on paper, I said to the secretary is the FM, not PM, sorry, that don't go back to FRBM. Don't stay with this if growth is restored. Growth was restored, but we didn't go back to FRBM. So we had a mini BOP crisis in 2013. So reform momentum. Here are again 2 different references. The one is to the 99 second generation reform paper, which I reviewed both the previous reforms, the transition we were in, etc., and the new development policy which are developed and published in EPW. You can click on these once we have these out. You can click on these and the references come. So there was a reform, some reforms. It doesn't matter, say that I'm not saying there was no reform. There was growth, but the reform momentum was lost. We stopped improving. So reform momentum lost. Senvat was implemented, which again one had worked on. Dr. Charan Singh mentioned. In fact, I started working on Senvat, Indian Senvat, when I was still at the World Bank, and one had proposed a national VAT based on that. GST was introduced, but then gridlocked in the center and states. They didn't go through. We had recommended UID, where all the technical and administrative details we had defined. I had, first in a paper and then as committee chair. But then again, this got gridlocked, so it didn't happen. Okay, job skills. A very important concept of job skills and private sector involvement to make sure demand matches supply the national skill development concept was developed, etc. This was formed also, the corporation, but again, gridlocked in center state. Nothing happened. No actual results. Very important, again, another learning point. Sometimes you can just do these things and you just forget about them and you don't get any benefits. You may even get negative effects. Okay. So just to, sorry to bring my own self into it, but this is a warning I gave all over in 2009 before I retired. I warned that you must do reform for sustaining fast growth. Remember that lesson which I told you? More reform, less and less benefit. So at some point, and that's happened during the 2013, the lost decade, when you stop doing real economic reforms, because what I had warned was you need for sustaining. And I even wrote along with a colleague, Malhotra, I wrote a paper for OECD in which it was formally stated. Okay, so lost decade, you're getting the growth benefit of past reforms. Important lesson. Just because growth is high, don't assume it's because what you are doing. Of course, you're doing good or bad things will contribute or slow it down, but you have to keep doing reforms if you want to grow at that very high level. Remember, we had got to the top 10% or 15%. We were at 5%, but let's say top 10%, okay, a reasonable number. Some of it can be random, okay, so we have to be careful. So to sustain your growth all over the country, this is not big countries only, by the way. This is all the countries in the world, okay? So to maintain your position in the top 10% of high growth economies, you got to keep doing reforms. You can't say I've done a whole lot of reforms and everything else will follow. So transition. So here we come to fifth phase, okay? So I hope I'm not taking too much time. Okay, let me speak. I think there's time. Yeah. So transition and liberalization. Why do I say transition liberalization? 2014 to 19, I say call it transition or mixed results because they were both positive and negative factors. So we know that in the previous P4B, there were more negative factors than positive. Here I would say they were also positive and negative, more evenly balanced, and let's see what they were. Macroeconomic reforms. Clearly, the macro was good. The fiscal target of 3%, which was in the FRBM, recall it was passed in 2003, was kind of rejuvenated, restored. So good, positive. Institutional reform, India Bankruptcy Code, which had been proposed for 30 years and neglected. Even the previous government had the opportunity in the new Corporations Act, Corporate Act, they didn't do it. Very good achievement, but there are issues which I'll just mention. Bad debt problem. It was designed to address very good reform from that perspective, and competition in management, which nobody had dared to address so far. So these are the positive effects to be expected. Monetary Policy Committee and flexible inflation targeting. No, though we had reservations, I had reservations, but I think you could say that by and large it could have been a positive thing. It implemented in the spirit of flexible inflation targeting. Goods and Services Tax, constitutional amendment, very good thing. But then negative side, multiple rates and cesses. You know, people don't see how the you can have more than 5 rates, but you have 15 cesses. That's all part of the rate structure with a small person. And MSC says it's very negative for MSMEs. People still don't realize. I've been saying it for the past 5 years, but still people don't understand that these huge number of cesses is a complication for the small person. Natural resources, we mentioned earlier. So the key learning from this is that natural resources are rents. And the key question in natural resources, these rents should not go to a monopolist or a private party, they should go to the government. So the only way to do it is through auction. So this is one of the learnings which I try to push in all natural resources that have private bidders, but do it through auctions, because that's the only way to assign. Again, I don't want to get into technical details. So let me leave it at that. Corporate tax reform, good thing. Unambiguously good thing, but it came at the end of 2019. So what are the negative measures in effect? Goal shift. I think there was a shift in P5A from growth revival to moral social issues like anti-corruption laws and demonetization. People may disagree with me. All kinds of things have been said about this, but I believe that this was driven by a moral or social objective of anti-corruption. I'm not saying that's a bad objective, but it had negative effects on economy. You can also say it is worth it. Again, I'm not making a moral judgment. Please, I'm only giving you the economic effects. Okay. And then the J-curve effect of institutional. I told you these three, IBC, GST, all good, could have been very good measures, very productive. We expected productive, but you're getting these J-curve effects. So initial effects of all three was actually an institution. Again, there's a paper on this which you can read. It's an EGROW paper, where the initial effects were negative. Okay. Again, the issue is not that we should not have done it. We should have done it. But I think greater attention to the potential negative effects would have obviated many of the problems. That's the only point I'm making. And it's a lesson for the future. I'm not here to make political judgments. I'm here to do the economics. Okay. So in all three, there was this issue. MPC, they talked flexible targeting, but they did hard, high real interest rate, serious targeting, which had serious J-curve negative effects in my view. Okay? Slow resolution of legacy debt problems. Here you can blame the government. I think governments have always been hesitant to address legacy. They say, oh, this is an old problem. Everybody thinks, oh, it'll go away. We didn't create it. Let's just leave it. Maybe with high growth, it'll go away. So delay. This is a natural common thinking. But if legacy problems had been resolved a little quicker, we would have less problems. We would have had more positive and less negative. And then protection bias, make in India tariffs. I will show this. It's in figure 1. We'll just come to it. So, and this is important. I'll show you the graph. So, so what was the effect of all these negative things? Reform credibility till the corporate tax reform, which happened after all this. Restored the balance. Reform credibility and market confidence suffered. Very important for productivity and growth. Investment and GDP growth therefore declined. They were put on a declining trend. We'll show you more graphs on this for later. Okay. So institutions and outcome, this I'm going to go very quickly over. These are some of the things which are in process and very important for the future, but we'll discuss these in detail. But I just wanted to put it for the record. I don't want to give the impression that there was nothing else positive done, because these are going to be important for the future. So I'm just listing them here: Digital India, DBT implementation, tech startups, environment, etc. So what was the outcome? So outcome table 2, I gave you a synopsis, but the actual one is that the per capita GDP growth actually accelerates, and the rank, India's rank, goes up to 10 from, I think, if you recall, 25, 26 in phase 3. And we go to the top 3% in phase A till 19. Okay? Was it all due to the reform during? No. Remember, in phase 4B, 4, the government, even though reform collapsed more or less, growth was still high. Okay. Here we had a mixed record. So what you do have is some of the macro measures, etc., and good FDI, etc. I have not listed everything because it was just a continuation. Did keep the growth up, but then it started slowing down when all the negative things caught up. Okay. So macroeconomics is very complicated. By the way, GDP is an essential component of macro. In the global macro theory, GDP is just part of macro. GDP growth, poverty, all these things. So outcome, if you just look at till 2019, was actually very good. If you looked at that, you say, oh, we are doing even better than the last time, which was pretty good itself. Okay. But then we had, and GDP growth stabilizes at 14th rank, top 7%. Okay. So if you just look at 5A, the reform things seemed very good, but I've told you the positive and negative things. And here's one of the negative. This is very important because there's a lot of misinformation on this. Everybody looks at the hump. Look at these two graphs. These are all data taken from WTO. It's not something I have constructed. People who keep complaining refuse to look at the data. It's incredible. Okay. This is the data from WTO, completely downloaded on my computer from WTO. And the two graphs are there. The simple one is the top one, which is the simple average duty or tariff. Okay. Look at this dotted line. See, so there's good. We were going down. Then we stabilize here. And in 2 years, 2018 and 19, yes, because of that Make in India policy, this tariff rate increases. bad thing. Everybody says, everybody agrees this was bad. But in the next year, it's almost down to the trend line. So there is some recognition here that this is not a good thing. It's not going to give you higher growth. That is the key point. Again, the focus that the only summary measure to look at when you're talking about policies and growth is per capita GDP growth, and of course poverty, however defined. So this is very important to remember. People refuse to acknowledge that the weighted tariff, which is the tariff from WTO, has actually now gone below the trend line. So, but as I will show at the end, we need to go further on this. Okay. So P3B. So what do we have? We have the most significant P5B. Sorry, from 2019 onwards, starting with the corporate tax, but 19 is in between, so I just mentioned it there. But that was in a way the start. And then you have a whole set of reforms coming in during the pandemic in 22 and 21. So what is it happening? So I'll give you a broad pictures. Commitment to and spirit of reforms are very good, and if it is maintained, it could be more significant than 1990 reform. But we are right in the middle of it, and we'll have to wait several years, 3-4 years, to see whether that actually happens. But what we can observe is change in philosophy, approach, and attitude. So there is a fundamental change from this communist, socialist ideology which permeated the whole economy. Of course, some of it was thrown out of the window in earlier phases, as I showed you, but some of it was still there in obscure places. So towards market economy and modern welfare democracy. This is very important. We have to go to a market economy and modern welfare democracy. And in some sense, that paper I told you, the 2002 paper, outlines the concept of what needs to be done to do this. Okay, that EPW paper, which once this is, you can click and read it. Key role of entrepreneurs, job and wealth creators: openness to practical information and knowledge. Okay, I should add here that I see less openness to analytical and theoretical constructs, which are very important for macroeconomic reform, actually. But let me leave that, I'll come back. Institutional reform to complete. The good thing that there is some recognition that you need also institutional reform to complement the policy reform and sustain them. But again, this is a little weak. The conception is not very clear. Okay? There is institutional reform, but it's not conceptually driven. So it appears to an outsider to be a little ad hoc. And also the change in attitude from directing everything to creating the environment so that people are incentivized and motivated to go in what we consider to be the right direction. So what is the specific policy action which proves what I am saying? Comprehensive systematic efforts to liberalize production and service sectors which were left: agriculture, space, atomic energy, BPO, work from home issue, drones, geo mapping, space, sports, air sports, infrastructure, you name it. There is an effort in every area to liberalize. That jungle of control which I mentioned, which is there in everything, okay, now is at least being systematically addressed in micro level, at industry level, at sector level, which is very important, because some of it I don't even know, even though I've spent a lifetime looking for these controls to try and eliminate them. Many of them we are not aware because they are so deeply into everything. But there's a systematic effort which is great, which is very commendable. Also, you may say agriculture, we tried and failed, doesn't matter. It's a good thing. Maybe, again, it's a separate subject we can discuss, but at least there is an effort to do this. And factor markets. IBC, I mentioned the market for loans, for management. Again, a complicated topic, but I just want to put it on record. Labor codes, bad bank. So wherever factor market reform did not happen, there is at least an effort to understand, to reform, etc. Again, as many people have pointed out, and as I've shown in the paper so far, you must go through with the rules, procedures, implementation if you want the benefits. Policy is good. It's a big step, but it won't get you that final benefit in productivity and growth unless you complete it and put it on the ground. This is sometimes forgotten. So you won't get the benefit. The next government may get the benefit. So it's very important. Public sector, PSC privatization, monetization, PPP on every level, an effort to reform. I'm not saying everything is perfect, but the first step is the big step is that policy change. And then, of course, it is the rules, procedures, implementation, if you want the benefit. I mean, the government which does the big change. Ease and cost of doing, a lot of discussion, again, rules and regulation, procedures, logistics. You heard of all this, I don't need to go into detail. And this modern welfare system with Indian characteristics. This is an area which I won't have time to because my focus may be in the questions again, but my focus is growth. Okay, so reforms and per capita growth. So here I put it right in front so you can see the thing and make the point. So average per capita growth accelerated with reform. This is a point I made. You can see the row 3, 2.9, 5.6, etc. till 5.8. Okay, but if you bring in the COVID years, there's a collapse. So average goes down dramatically to 4.3%. Okay, steady rise to world average. This thing here again. So it's some people say, oh, the whole world was rising, so there's nothing exceptional about India. Not true. If you compare with the world, the growth is steadily accelerating. Same phases. I have not given point P1 here because that's not the purpose. 1.6, 2.4, 3.4, 3.8. Okay. India versus LMIC. India is now in LMIC for the last 5 years or so. So some people may say, okay, let's just compare with LMIC. Well, yes, here the performance is more mixed. We are actually, there is a point here that we are kind of keeping up with the LMIC, and in the last P5A, we actually did better. But it seems like all the LMIC are maybe they were LMIC or they've come up, are doing this. They are improving. To give you 2 examples, Vietnam and Bangladesh, which I'll show in a separate paper. But that's just an example. The other lower income countries on the border are also doing reforms, and they are beginning to catch up with us. So we are not showing very high increase in growth over the LMICs. This is important. We should not get arrogant. Okay, arrogance is the worst thing to have. We must be aware both of our strengths and our weaknesses if we want to do better. So this is a very important point here. Okay, so COVID shock. Now the negative part, the COVID shock has really done a great disservice to this country. COVID shock has reduced average P5 growth by 1.4%. Okay? So it's gone down from 5.6 to 4.3. If you just take the average up to 2019 or you will go up to 21, that's the difference. You can imagine the huge shock. I'll show you a graph shortly which brings it out. Then loss of GDP needs to be made up with above medium long-term trend growth for the next few years. This is where we need more effort. We cannot rest on our laurels. It requires greater effort than even I had anticipated in 2019-20. This is an important point I want to make and convey to the policy makers, the decision makers. Okay, that yes, that a great amount of reforms has been done, but there's a serious issue here. The COVID has actually thrown us off balance a little bit. So we'll probably need to work harder. And here's a graph which kind of shows it dramatically. Let me just read these things and then I'll share. So the pink graph is that thing I told you. This is annual per capita GDP growth, and pink is the trend line of the India minus the world, and green is India minus the LMICs. It shows you the performance of India relative to the world and relative to lower middle income countries of which we are a member. Okay, the red curve and the green curve are the trend. So let us see what's happening. So COVID is a severe setback to growth. Though India's growth relative to world remains on an uptrend, this pink thing. Okay, some evening out, but I think with this new reform, we can actually put us back on a slightly slowly rising uptrend. But if we see compared to the lower middle income countries, it's pulled us down. Okay, this is a fact. It's a sad fact. We can't hide from it, but we must make an effort. It can be reversed. This is not. So the crisis provided an opportunity for major reform, big positive. I've given you some of the reforms and then approach. 2 waves of COVID followed by oil shock have resulted in a loss of GDP. This doesn't have the 22 data. It's only the international data is available up to 21. Oil shock has raised uncertainty and downside risk. So the FY22 forecast, my forecast remains the same, but with a wider uncertainty band of 1% compared to the earlier in the beginning I had given about 9 months ago. 0.5. So the bottom line, reforms have to be pursued with greater vigor to ensure more than 6% per capita growth or more than 7% GDP growth as an average over the next decade or two. Okay? Again, we're talking long run. We'll have to make up this loss which has happened relative to the lower middle income countries. So sustaining inclusive growth. So finally, I come to the policy. So I'm saying we need to do a little more. And what are the things? You may ask, what is it? You can say all kinds of things, but you have no suggestions. Well, I have a whole bunch of suggestions, and others have many more. There's no time to go into each and every one of them. So one of them is the macroeconomic. Remember, I hinted that I sense a little gap in fund. You see, industries are things people can see. If I want to buy an electronic product, I can see whether it's coming from China or whether it's made in India, whether it's good or bad, what the policy is, etc. Macroeconomics is very complicated because you do something there and the effects happen on the other side. Okay, so you need theory, you need a model, you need a model of the economy. And the model, there's no single model. The model which is precisely applied, the range of things can be the same set of things. There can be 10 things which are important. But in India, in one period, it may be number one issue, maybe A. In some other country, the number one issue may be D. So it's more complicated. It's hard to understand what is the link between taxes reform like GST, DCT, custom, direct tax code, DTC, sorry, direct TC, DC. Oh, this is also side error. But it will empower the MSMEs and make the whole economy more competitive. Okay, it's about level playing field. It is not about you and me or one person versus the other. It's the whole economy. That's the difficult concept of macro. If you make certain changes, everybody benefits. Some may benefit a little more, some may benefit a little less. Okay, but everybody benefits. That's the concept of macroeconomics, which comes from the model. You can't see it in the world. It's more complicated to ferret it out. Remember what I said about the phase 2 reforms, that I found the key variable was the liberalization of the capital account. Lots of things happened. I have lists in my papers. I have lists of 20 reforms which were done during the 80s. But how did I show that it's complicated? Okay, the macroeconomy, you have to figure out. There are many threads. Okay, sorry for that little lecture. So tax reform. Now I'll quick. So trade reform. I've been recommending a dualistic policy. Some elements the government has adopted. The FTAs with DCs were part of that. Customs duty reform has not happened, which I mentioned earlier. It's very important. It's part of that whole structure, which will give you a big boost in growth, maybe higher than what I have anticipated. I have just used an average of reforms which are based on past. If you can do better than that, you can do better in growth. Okay? So FTAs with DCs, PLI. This is a slight warning. I have supported PLI right from the time it is implemented. But again, I find that the conceptual basis is lacking. So it's beginning to take on an ad hoc character. Okay? Good idea. But you need to get the theory. You need to fit it into a model. You need to fit it into the macro economy. Because things have indirect effects, which unless you think about when you model them, okay, you have an idea of a model of how the Indian economy works. You can't figure out exactly. You see the direct effect. PLI introduced here. XYZ people have given, so many people have given proposals, so many people are investing, but you don't see the overall effect, okay, without a model, without a theory. Okay, let me speed up. Sorry for that little lecturing, but modern professional regulation, again, it's conceptual. It's the understanding of asymmetric information model hazard. These are not words. For somebody who's studied information economics, some of you may know that Joe Stiglitz got a Nobel Prize for information. It's complicated. It's not simple. Okay, so you have to think through carefully to devise regulations. And here's the good part: the empowerment. This is happening, but it started. But I think many more people need to pay attention to this. We can use digital as a lever in our India Vision 2050, the paper, which is again EGROW paper, where we'll have further discussions on that, hopefully. in the next several months. But this digital e-medicine, e-education, work from home can be a big driver for inclusion. Okay, so this empowerment, digital empowerment is much more important than people realize. Job scale from lowest to highest, we mentioned NRDC, etc. That there's been a gridlock. There's been efforts made right through to the current thing, but that gridlock is still is going down. But we've still not seen the big benefits. We need job skills everywhere, from the lowest. We need it from the low physical therapist, the person who takes care of the aged. Very simple. But to do good, to be productive, to earn your higher income, you have to be trained to the highest skill level. Artificial intelligence, robotics. Okay, that whole level is a huge demand in India and abroad. This can be a big driver of growth. Again, there is recognition, but somehow we are not able to do, to break that. We are making progress, but not broken. Criminal justice system, again, indirect effects. You don't realize when you look, each of us outrages ke police ye galat kar rahi hai, judges ye kar rahe hain, etc., etc. But the system itself is very important for a stable economic, sustained high growth. Okay? Again, I don't want to take more time. I want to try and finish the last probably slide. And so the problem here is the whole concept of jails is what is called criminal crime deterrence. But we have a conviction rate of major crimes of between 10 and 15%. Who is going to be deterred? So it's all free for all. We are depending on the goodness of, moral, spiritual persons. It won't work forever. It will break down. It's breaking down. So you need to reform the criminal justice system and raise it to 50 to 75%. Okay, this is pathetic. And at some point, it starts affecting the economy. Right now, so far, I don't see that effect, but it can happen. Okay, it's like fiscal deficits. You can sometimes have enormous deficits for 5-10 years, and then the whole economy collapses. This criminal justice system is like that. You can go on and on. And by the way, this is in that 2002 paper. I asked for reform of the criminal justice system. It will just break down sometime. Okay, not 5 years, not 10 years, maybe 15 years. But again, this is the macro effect. Okay? It is not it's not a question of whether, a murderer, this particular murderer is caught, this kind of thing. It's the macro effects I'm emphasizing. It's a difficult concept. That's why I keep saying it. I'm sorry for being a bit of a lecturer here. And of course, financial decontrol, etc., regulation, I've talked about the asymmetric influence, etc. Okay, so I think I'm going to, one little thing which I've been pushing, which I think is very important for going towards capital account convertibility, like the dual exchange rate. Remember, I devised the concept of a dual exchange rate as a transition to a free market exchange rate. The same way I envisage a convertible digital rupee as a convertibility. We are not in a position to go immediately to convertibility. I think this is going to be an important thing. That's why I put it on record. I think that can be as important as a dual exchange rate, to create a convertible digital rupee, which you can control for some time, or like a baby. You can grow it for a little years, let's say 5 years, and then let it go when the economy is strong enough to take it. So thank you for patiently listening. Sorry, what happened? The rest was a summary. I just leave it here. I'm finished. We can take this off whenever. Thank you for listening patiently. This is just a summary of just to remind you where I started. Okay, very quickly. So we went from 107th, P1, P2, P3, P4, P5. Remember, P5 is not finished. I'm taking the average available so far, ongoing. So the rank went from 107 to 35 to 25 to 26 to 10 in the 5 phases. And we improved from bottom 20 to top 20 to top 15 to top 5%. Or if you take both, let's say 5 to 10%. You take GDP, which is 9%, depending on what you look at. That's a great achievement. Okay, and the reforms which have happened in 20 and 21 lay the basis, in my view, for further reform. But COVID has kind of spoiled this party. Otherwise, we would be booming by this year. And of course, the oil shock thing. but I think we can still retrieve it if we apply our minds to it and are open to a little more openness to kind of theoretical things which are key to macroeconomic reform. They are not like industry reform. Industry reform, the pragmatic people, when I focused on individual industries like, let's say, electronic or steel industry or capital goods, what I did was I used to talk to that industry people. They have much more knowledge. Okay, the contribution of an economist like me can make and made for so many years was to put it in a model framework. You fit it, okay, into a conceptual framework which allows you to trace the things and decide. How do you decide that textile is we know textiles is more labor intensive, okay, and something else like steel is very capital intensive. Does that mean we only do textile? No. You have to put it, yes, for textiles you have to do customs reform and GST reform. For other things you need to do other things. So this model helps you connect the pieces, okay, and it tells you where to focus, which will give you more benefit, which you have to be more careful, etc. Thank you. Thank you for being so patient.
This is really very illuminating, and in a way we have covered a very wide canvas, starting from 1985, I would say, because I've been in Reserve Bank since 1984 and looking at reforms and seeing the Rajiv Gandhi come in, and then the era that was there till 1990, and then of course our import challenges that happened with very low foreign exchange reserves and the 1991 reforms that unfolded. So this has been really, for me again, learning as well as visiting my old challenges over these periods. I would request if anyone wants to ask questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and I will come over and we'll invite you to ask your question. To begin the discussion, Dr. Virmani, as I looked at it, I would say your the talk that you presented today or the strategies that you followed, I think persistence pays. And I thought that is what you kept saying, that you had to push the reforms to get them through. And your observation is so correct that the chains, the licenses were so deep and permeated so widely that they had to be really teased out and took lots of time. And so therefore persistence pays to clean the system. I think the other point which you made is very valid, need for a comprehensive policy. The emphasis that you laid on models, because you meant that I touch this thing, but somewhere else, 5 years down the line, I see a different impact there. So I thought that was very good. And therefore, the need for experts and need for seasoned experts to look at these policy issues and make recommendations is so obvious. I must mention at Harvard, you've been there, I've been there, I noticed that law and commerce play a very prominent role. And your last slide, where you mentioned about the justice system being strong, if the conviction rate is so low, how do you really inspire confidence and ensure credibility of your ecosystem? So I think you brought in very valid points. I have just two questions, and we are welcoming questions from others. And to begin with, I have just two questions. One is you mentioned about UID. I wanted to know more from you about it because it got implemented only recently under the Aadhaar card. But in your presentation, I could see that you have spoken about it much earlier. So wanted to know what was your idea and why did it not get implemented then? At the
Yeah.
later stage in your presentation, and that's my second question,
Mhm.
you mentioned about empowering MSMEs. So I would like to know more about your thoughts on MSMEs because we all agree that MSMEs are the future employment generators in the country. The last question, Dr. Virmani, you've been in the middle of this transition from the highly controlled regime to now a very liberal regime. And I can see every day in the discussion that still the acceptability of the private sector taking the lead is not really there. So, what would be your thoughts on how do we really encourage everybody to accept that the private sector should lead our journey now onwards rather than the public sector continuing to play a prominent role? Thank you very much. And in the second round, we'll again collect some questions. We welcome your questions. You can raise your hand. I can come there or put it in the chat box and I'll read out the question.
Right. Thank you, Charan. I think those are very important questions. So let me start in the order that you mentioned. So first is UID. So it turns out, my memory is slightly failing, but it turned out somebody is doing research on this issue. And he went through all my papers, very interesting. And he discovered a 2002 paper, which I wrote with one of my colleagues in Planning Commission, 2002, where I first put the concept of UID. He told me this because I had forgotten my own paper. So anyway, from 2002 to 2006, I developed this concept. And the basic idea, which was in another paper in 2006, and I can tell you my experiences depending on how much time we have. I don't know. I should be a little quicker now, I think, Yeah. So in the 2006 paper, my experience during those years told me that there were a lot of people, we had, okay, very briefly, there were about 200 to 250 different programs which could be talked as anti-poverty, not strictly anti-poverty, but all directed towards somehow development of the poor regions or poor people or poor something, right? 200 programs when I counted. And I was shocked to know that one state, doesn't matter who it was, the food secretary of that fellow, somebody asked him, there are people starving in your XY district. He said, we can't get food to them. Okay, we had a PDS. I was in charge of PDS, part of that development policy division to give me the staff. PDS was under my charge. So the point was, there was this mismatch, which I saw through this horrifying example, that we have 200 different programs at center, state level, and we can't get food to a person who doesn't have food because of drought or somewhere. So the concept of UID was that if we can, identify each, not just the poor, but above them, the above poor, let's say below 50%, all those who need some form of welfare program, then we could match what we were giving with each person. So, I mean, just simply, let's, for the sake of example, say bottom 25%. So if you are able to give a number on the computer, you have every single person's name and address on your computer. And then you have programs. So you link all programs, you have lists of people. You had a PDS system, you had a ration card. Every program has a list of people, okay? So the creation of a UID would be able to match. So for in this modern age, for every single person below that 25% line, we would know exactly which programs are getting and who is not getting any program. I'm telling you, this was a big shock to me. I mean, how can you have hunger in India? Hunger is not just poverty, okay? People starving. So that is actually the origin of UID. So what happened? So in 2009, I put that in an anti-poverty book paper and defined how this would happen. 2006, sorry. In 2009, I convinced the Planning Commission to set up a committee. Again, these dates are a little imprecise, but excuse me, because my mind is not so sharp, I'll have to look up. But let's say around 2008-9. No, sorry, I remember now. It was before I moved to the Finance Ministry, which was 2006. Yes, in 2006 itself, I convinced the Planning Commission to set up a group under my chairman, which defined precisely, which had from IT department, registrar of companies, everybody, okay, election commission also, where we defined the concept of UID, we defined the administrative structure, we did an experiment to show it was feasible, and it was very feasible. So the whole concept was developed by the committee, and then the IT department put that thing up to the it had to be put up to the cabinet for approval. I, of course, left, but then it turns out that it was stuck by interministerial wrangling. Till finally they set up the UID authority and got the first chairman, Mr. the IT Infosys can.
Nilakani.
Right. So that gap was due to political decisions. Some people saw that it's such a great idea, they didn't want it. I had recommended, and people had agreed in that committee, that let it be with the planning commission for various reasons. I don't want to go into details, but they were all resisting it. But finally, it was set up in the planning commission and implemented by the current government, actually. So no, it was started during the previous, and then this government took it much further. So that is the brief history of UID. Okay, so MSME. I think here it is a different problem. It's as I was kind of hinting. There's a conceptual problem. When we think of MSME, we only think of what they tell you. We don't think of the macro effects. And to be very brief, all these three tax reforms which I'm saying, they are motivated by leveling the playing. See, if it's a large company, they have a CA, they have a lawyer, they can computerize everything, they can get program and people to just run them. Complication mean nothing to them. But to an MSME, a one-man show, two-man show, it's a huge cost. Okay, so any complex tax system which they have to participate in enormously raises costs and has macroeconomic effects. It's not just MSME. MSME, if they are standing on their feet and competing without subsidies, this is nothing to do with subsidies. It's just leveling the playing field for MSMEs through reform of direct tax code, customs duties, and GST. That itself will give a big macro boost. Okay, they will compete, they will prosper, they will generate jobs and do it on their own feet. So I would say, for lack of time, let me leave it at that. Finally, private sector. Yes. So this is a different job. Here I must commend, and I said it in my talk, the current government has done a lot to do that. But this is the thing. I think, again, it's not blowing my trumpet, but it's simpler. That paper I did 2002 actually tried to explain to people that what is the correct role of private sector, government, etc., NGOs, even NGOs I addressed at that point, okay? That there is a proper role for each of them where they can do best, where they are best suited. And that's one thing, that private sector is the producer. But the key second point there is that it's a government duty to ensure competitive markets. You see, if you don't ensure competitive markets, there are oligopolies and monopolies, then the traditional thing applies. But everything is not a monopoly. Earlier our concept in socialism was Monopolies Act. I don't know if anybody remembers, I didn't even mention it. There was a Monopoly Act where the fellows in the Monopoly Commission thought everything is a monopoly. That's not true. Okay, we know from all over the world the things they were saying a monopoly are not monopolies. In many other countries, in almost every other country, okay, but they can be gray areas. So as long as you ensure that in gray areas, the government policy structure, the tax structure, etc., that's again this macro linkage, is promoting competition and anti-monopoly in a modern scientific economic way, then there will be no objection because everybody benefits. Where people don't benefit is where you allow them, where you deliberately. There are many countries, again, I don't want to name any specific countries, where there is one industrialist. There was recent, in Africa, again, I don't want to mention the specific country, one fellow was accused of being in cahoots with the prime minister of that country and ripping off the country. If you have that kind of crony capitalism or if you have monopolies, then yes, business is not bad, but that's your own creation. So my whole life in a way has been trying to see what are the policies needed, which will promote competition and not create monopolies. In fact, work against monopolies and for competition. So that is the key. If you can promote competition, you can safely leave it to the private sector.
Dr. Ashima Goel is asking a question. Professor Goel, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it was a really comprehensive, very interesting talk. But I'm trying to on the video. This internet connection is a bit unstable.
Yeah, we can hear
on my
you.
phone. Yeah.
I even see
So-
you.
Right.
Yeah, we can see you now too. Yeah.
So, this idea of, I think that after 30 years, do we still have to define reforms as sort of liberalizing reforms? In a sense, haven't we gone beyond that? That now the issue should be that we're improving the supply side, whatever it takes. Like one of our big failures was that we went in for planning and we neglected development of human capital. That is what really drives innovation and inclusive growth and so on. So do we look at, and this is also important from, when you look at it as inflation targeting, it's a lot, we're a high cost economy. So, when you talk about liberalization and it affects a lot of people, like recently, again, there's talk of bank privatization, PSP, and then the unions are up in arms, farm liberalization. So look at the sort of the political resistance, what is feasible? Like technology, there's a technology trend where we can ride given our youth and, like UID, etc., other inclusive, or using our UPI and to have a digital rupee, etc. So where there is low cost, where it's feasible, where we can really improve our competitiveness and reduce costs, make India a low cost economy. And then I think overall macro policies can keep demand stimulative and you can have high growth with deficit ratios coming down as denominators rise, etc. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So just a brief, there's no disagreement in principle. I just want to, for the general listener. So there are two aspects here. You see, what I emphasize is job skills. Why? Because in the general public, and general public now I mean economists, there's a bias towards education and not specific job skills. So the whole idea of the national skill, so clearly there is no problem. I mean, the percentage of people in schools have gone up tremendously. The education, the number of people in higher education has gone up over the last 10 years. So it's not that we neglected it, okay? And as you well know, the issue is of quality. But there are a lot of people emphasizing, I'm not saying it's not important, but the problem I faced in my years, maybe it's changed now because I'm not in the stuff now directly. But the skilling aspect, for example, I used to say at that time when DSDC was formed, that there are 2,500 different skills which have internationally, which have certification and standards. They are there in Australia, they are there in Europe, and we don't even know about them. Okay, 2,500. That's where you'll get the self-employment of professionals. And as I mentioned briefly in the talk, which people may have missed, they range from speech therapists, physical therapists. Everybody can say I'm a physical therapist, but they are professional standards. They are, they are skills which have to be developed. I know a friend, I won't name him, whose daughter was handicapped. Okay, she had a major accident and had to be trained in physical and therapy. There was nobody. He couldn't find a single speech and physical therapist in India, not one. He had to go abroad. He had to get a job abroad so he could look after his daughter. Okay, so I emphasize the job skills. Agree completely. Human capital, yes. Higher education is needed for AI, etc., etc. But there is all these things where if you are going to raise the productivity and income of this bottom 75% of the population, you need to raise the skills of the service sector. That's what this is. These are job skills. I don't know how many, but a majority of that 2,500 is actually service-related skills. So we have a service sector, which is the probably largest at our per capita income level, but we are not upgrading the service skills. So I keep emphasizing skills, but there's no disagreement on human capital. One other small point, which again, matter of emphasis. Everybody talks about health, but in my view, the key issue is not health, it is public health. COVID happened, we are still talking about heart attacks and cancer. Okay, did we have the skills? We did not have the institutional skills to manage a pandemic. That's public health issue. It is not a health issue in the conventional sense in which it is sought. We keep saying, oh, there is somebody who couldn't get to hospital and died of a heart attack. Yes, very emotional, very important problem for the system. Public health is important. Not only do people suffer, but the whole economy suffers. Okay, public health. So again, I emphasize, and as you may know, I showed in a paper, a cross-country and a cross-state paper, that so-called malnutrition was not a problem of children, was not a problem of food. It was a problem of sanitation. I have two papers which showed this, okay? And what is it? Then I discovered later, a few years later, that there is a problem called environmental entropy, which has been proved in Africa, which the bug gets into the children's stomach and they cannot absorb the food. It's not the food, it's the absorption. And it's all linked to sanitation. So, agree with you 100%, but the solution is always, sometimes you have to catch your ear by the back rather than just going on pulling it from here. That's all. Okay, thank you. Sorry, that's a very good question. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree with that example that you gave.
Hello.
Yeah, real
Yes.
challenges.
There was one person raising a hand. There's Dr. Gupta and maybe others. Yes.
Yes, there are many questions, but
Yeah.
yes, please, Dr. Gupta, go ahead.
I need to know from your talk today was about the future as well, because I think Dr. Virmani ended it as of today's programs. But I think the future is going to look a little bit bleak because our education system is not taking into account the depth. It's only instant education with no depth, thus digital dividends giving today's profits and no mental intellectual growth. Do you think that there's going to be a fallout of all this, minimalizing our education system, which wants only instant profits, instant gain, like instant coffee? We already have laymen. We need to have layman skills, not at the education level. I think Mr. Virmani talked about promoting skills through education. That's not it. We in India have got natural aptitude towards entrepreneurial skills, which is already developed in the non-formal sector through family upbringing. So we don't need to spend much time on those, improving those skills. They can teach us something. What we need is getting depth into education, into something. Otherwise, our future is bleak for the young people. They'll only be there's no intellectual growth, no depth into any teaching, any academic lines. I don't think anything is there going on here.
Sure.
in our
Dr.
country.
Gupta, just because of time, if you can be brief, otherwise we have got the point that you have made. I will come to Dr. Virmani to respond.
Let's take, is there
Yeah.
some,
I
okay, I
wanted-
can respond.
I wanted you to collect a few questions also. There are
I noted it down. I will answer this if you
Yeah.
take a few more.
There are quite a few of them in the chat box, so let me just summarize them, and then you can take a call in responding to them. There was a question on banking and future, and I think the question is basically the role of banking. Would you like them more in the private sector, or do you think the public sector will continue to play a prominent role or should continue to play a prominent role? There's a question on trade agreements and its role ahead. There's a question on international financial architecture and India's benefit from it or role in it, and also a question of PTAs. And there's another question which I thought was again dealing with PTAs, India UAE agreement. So if you have a view on that, let me just share 2-3 more questions. Then you take a final call on how to respond.
Yeah, so I've also seen that FTA question and banking. Let me come to that. Let me just quickly do the education because it connects with Dr. Ashima's question also. So, I don't think there's any agreement between Dr. Gupta, Dr. Goyal and myself on the need for improved education. The questioning is how to produce it, right? That's the issue. And of course, we are going to, if I've understood you right, you're going to have a special session on education, right? Soon.
2 weeks from now, we are getting Dr. Kingdon, Professor Geeta Kingdon to speak on education with us.
So we will address that issue very specifically, but just from my macro perspective, I'll just make few comments. That is not the final answer, Dr. Gupta. So please join us when they have education as a special discussion. So here are the two things. So in the digital area, it's a new field. There is, I mentioned information economics. There are very few people in this country and perhaps across the world who understand information economics. There is, when we go to digital, there is a problem of what is called network economics. And this is a new field. So digital education is not being regulated right now. So perhaps the first issue which arises is that is there some need for some kind of a regulation of both digital health and digital education? And if I was in the government, I would be looking at that. I think it's certainly a valid question to raise on digital. But let me address the broader question. Now, skills, I disagree with you. I just gave an example. I'm sorry, I disagree strongly with you. I gave you one example. There are hundreds of examples I have personally come across. Treatment of aged. I have had parents, my family parents dying. We cannot find a trained nurse to look after them. Okay? They cannot handle emergencies. I mean, we have to do it, you know. If somebody is gasping for breath, just simple training, get them some oxygen, okay, or call us or call somebody. No, I disagree with you strongly. I have personal experience. There is not enough skills. There are hundreds and thousands of skills in the health sector which we need training, we need certification, we need standardization. There are entrepreneurs. I agree with you that entrepreneurship doesn't need training. That is, I agree 100% with you. I don't agree with the people who keep emphasizing entrepreneurial skill. That is the least important. But there are tens of skills. Okay, I have personally watched over people, carpenters, over plumbers. I've seen them do work in front of me. Okay, they don't have any skills. It's all random. Okay, something gets stuck. You need to make a hole. You bang it. There are simple tools which you could be trained to just cut. Okay, neat cut. I would be willing to pay 50% more for a trained plumber or a trained carpenter. Not everybody would. There is an issue of market, okay? But I do not agree with you that we have all the skills and we don't need skilling. I strongly disagree with you. I'm not saying it today. I've looked at this issue for the last 20 years. Now, education. You are right. I think there is an issue of digital companies making money from, the easy part of the market, let's say. But that's also true. They have been training academies. Where I live, there is a whole street which has 20 training academies. Okay, are they regulated? No. Do you know how much they cheat the students? I don't know. They are not regulated. So there is an issue of regulation. I agree with you. But this is not the first time. It's not that it's happened, but that is no excuse for not regulating them or putting some regulations on them. I'm not taking an excuse. I told you that if I was in the government, this would be one of the things I would be making sure is looked at. So I don't have a disagreement on that. Now, what is the key? So the key from digital thing which we have tried to study, and we've had 2 or 3 talks in EGROW, the key thing we find between health and education, as far as e-education versus e-health is concerned, health actually, if you have a intermediary who knows a little bit of health, direct information is actually much better than the quacks which they go to. We have research studies showing that 50% of the public in rural areas, or even more in rurals, get advice from quacks who know nothing. It's all random. So e-medicine with some degree of regulation can vastly improve the health outcomes in rural area. Education is slightly different. So all over the world, the research has shown that really you need teachers. Okay, you need good teachers. So the concept of e-education is really, my concept is that we should be able to digitally provide help to rural teachers. That's the first target, to improve their education. You cannot do it without those teachers, but they need help. They don't have all the teaching methods. You could devise lectures, you could devise virtual experiments, you could devise, and the last budget has actually made this. They created a university and provided funds for this to create, so that the teacher could sit in front of the TV, use the programs which are available, and then try to explain and engage the students. So again, to summarize, teachers are critical for education because at the younger age, particularly, it's completely different. It may be different at a higher level. That's a separate topic. But at the school level, kids need a human interaction. So I agree with you. And the most important role, in my view, for digital is to help the teacher. Okay, I'm sorry we are running out of time. We won't have time for you to respond. I better be quicker. So FTA, PTA is a very important role. I mentioned them in my reform things that PLI, this FTAs and PTAs with developed countries, which is UK, USA, EU, Japan are very important because supply chains are adjusting. Right now, we are at a moment in history where a lot of MNCs, see, MNCs are based headquarters mostly in Europe, USA, and of course, UK being smaller than those two, also in the UK, a few in Japan and South Korea. But there is a system called internal trade in these MNCs. So unless you're part of the MNC supply chain, you miss out on a lot of the efficiency and exports. So you have to become a part of that. And PTAs and FTAs with these 4 sets of countries or regions is very important for India to get into the supply chain, which we have been completely out of. Part of the reason why Southeast Asia, including Vietnam and other countries, have done so much better in exports than us is they are part of these MNC supply chains. And to do that, we need the PTAs, FTAs. So FTAs, PTAs, they have a very important role. The government has understood that. I already told you that PLI scheme is good, but needs to be carefully thought through and restricted, not made ad hoc, and whoever comes, give them a PLI. And thirdly, the customs duty reform must also be integrated for long-term sustainability. So yes, they are important. On banking, well, we're kind of running out of time, but public-private, I will go with, everybody has their own theory and thing, but at this point, we have a strategy laid out by the government of India. I think the most important thing is now not to debate that endlessly and again raise fundamental question, but to implement this as quickly as possible. And the strategy is this. They will take the 5 largest public sector banks, or 3 largest actually, and keep those. And they will merge some of the smaller banks into number 2 and 3. The largest is SBI, that will remain. The second and third largest, some of the lower other ones will be merged, and India and government will maintain control about 3 of those. The rest will be privatized. I think till that thing is accomplished, I think that's the best policy. We should all get behind it and ask the government or help the government to do it as quickly as possible. Charan, if there's some...
There was a question on international financial architecture.
Architecture, okay.
Yeah,
so
there's another one question which you have been the ED at the IMF and in charge and representing Sri Lanka. There's a question related to Sri Lanka and of course something on freebies, and you've been the MOF, maybe you have a view on that. And then of course, because you have specialized in trade and you have discussed so much of trade, there's also question on sustainability in terms of trade. So this is how I would summarize the 3 questions if you would like to address.
Yeah, I'll do it quickly. Okay. So the trade part I've kind of answered. It's a combination of what I call a dualistic trade policy, which includes these 3 elements, PLI, PTAs, FTA with advanced countries to get part of the supply chain. The objective is very clear. The customs duty reform is very important for MSMEs, textile sector, especially the labor intensive, the upstream sectors are all MSMEs, really, directly or indirectly, even if there may be a trader who actually exports their product. So it's the customs duty reform and the GST reform are very important to bring MSMEs into the picture, which overall is necessary also for job creation, good quality job creation. So that is the overall structure, which I really don't have much to add at this point. And that should happen if we really want to get the full benefits of each of these schemes. We think we are doing very well on one scheme and it's great and that will solve the problem. It's the same thing which I mentioned. It's that you may think this one is pretty, but it won't work unless you have all 3. The work meaning get good. real productive growth effects. Okay, that's a distinction you must keep in mind. When I say work, I'm not saying it won't produce some results. It will. Is to get the big bang in the growth and productivity. Okay, and that requires meshing all these three, which requires a macro approach. It doesn't, not one thing separately we refine it. It doesn't work. Macro doesn't work like that. Okay, so on architecture, so here's the issue. So there are different aspects. One is the banking reform, right? So part of that effort is to create 2 or 3 large and efficient, and that will only happen if there is competition. Okay, without that competition part, again, that's how it meshes. Unless you privatize or bring private sector into some of these other banks and allow them to merge, etc., privately, okay, you won't get the competition and you won't get this benefit of these large banks going abroad. So one is banking. You need to create the competition to create SBI and the other 1 or 2 public banks so they can compete with the larger banks outside. That's one element of it. Second is the stock market. Our stock market, the last time I looked at it, it was between 7th or 6th position. Okay. As the stock market grows and we've been reforming slowly, hopefully we can also keep doing that. Sometimes it slows down. It needs to be, kept on. You don't need big bang reforms. You need slow and steady improvement in regulations and SEBI to make it the commensurate with the size of the economy. Economy will be around, and this paper will come out soon. I will have these projections. In about 5 years, India will be the 3rd largest economy. You've got to make sure that your stock market also is the 3rd largest by that time. And the third element is fiscal and exchange rate. Again, I hinted at it. It was my last point on sustaining inclusive growth, financial decontrol and regulation, and fiscal monetary consistency. So in the last economic survey, which I did before retiring as chief economic advisor, this was one of my last or the one before that. I said, if we want capital account convertibility, we'll have to bring our fiscal deficit down to 0, the government fiscal deficit, okay? Because there's too much bias against India's fiscal deficits. If we maintain this 3% government, central 3% state thing forever, that convertibility is going to be a difficult thing. So these 3 elements we have to produce, and I've added a second element at the end of it, which I said in my talk, which is the convertible rupee. In my view, if you do the fiscal monetary consistency with an open capital account, you can use this fully convertible digital rupee to transition from the controlled capital market, relatively controlled, which we have, to a convertible. If you get these 3 things going, let's say in 10 years' time, then India can become a financial power. Okay, then we can talk about, then we can influence the architecture. Without it, nobody is going to pay attention to you. You have to have the strength. Why are people listening to you? Because today, this year, we are the 5th largest economy in the world. That is why people are listening. Similarly, you have to do these 3 things in the financial sector to strengthen the financial sector, and then you'll see that you will be listened to in devising, modifying the financial structure. On Sri Lanka, I think it's a separate subject. I would try to answer it, but I've avoided it in the TVs. Many people have called me. I don't mind, but we are really way over our time. So I don't know if the freebies and SL is connected. No fiscal person. I told you. I just said capital markets. If you want to be a strong capital market, financial part of global financial architecture, you may have to go to 0 fiscal deficit. So where is the question of freebies? You need more reform of the welfare system. I have long proposed direct cash transfers. So all that is a welfare reform, which, yeah, you're right. I have not mentioned it, but that's a whole area we can discuss further. But the key element of it is what I call, again, if you are interested, read the very simply written out in the India Vision 2050 paper of ours at EGROW, where I outline a welfare stack with 3 critical elements. One is a website where all the programs are listed. So each side, in fact, all the recipients can go to the website and find out which things they are entitled to and what they are getting. A mobile-based direct cash transfer system where, wife and husband can be divided any benefit. And if the husband is moving around, is in working in Bombay, wife is in the village, they independently on their phone get it. So mobility, separability, so that you'll never have a case like we had the COVID migrant crisis. They would have got the benefits on their phone as they moved from state to state. They could have cashed it. That's my vision for 2050. So 1, 2, and the third element, stack, phone, and the direct tax. Yeah, I mixed the two together. The direct cash transfer, clubbing all the anti-poverty programs into a direct cash transfer system, so that you don't have tens of these programs and people looking all over, and eventually combining them into a single. So that really is the solution, in my view, to 3Bs.
Now that we have saved the minute that you didn't speak about Sri Lanka, can I ask by replacing that with another question? You have worked a lot on GST, and there's a question persistently coming, and I thought it was worth your time. If you could tell us, what do you think about GST and economic growth? And day by day changing, GST may affect the MSME production and consumption. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so GST is something I've been, again, we have an EGROW paper. Of course, one has been thinking about this and commenting on Twitter for a long time, but for those who are seriously interested, look at the paper, but I'll summarize. So the key here, there are three elements. Well, the history I already gave you. I told you that the constitutional amendment was a big step, but we kind of missed the opportunity to make it more simple. A large part of due to this 15 cess, which really wasn't part of the structure, but were designed to make sure to satisfy the states so that they think. So I have suggested that these 15 cesses at least be just focused on two industries, the tobacco industry and the auto industry. Leave everybody else out of it. If you can just restrict the cess to these two, where most of the money anyway comes from. The other is just an irritant, no use. There'll be a huge simplification of the GST. And of course, some simplification where, again, one has given the thing with very simply 75% on goods and services should have 15%, which meets the overall productivity efficiency gains will get you. About 1/8 of them should be exempt to make sure that the system is progressive. So food, basic health services and education should be exempted. It's too much of a hassle. It is good to exempt them for the purpose of, equitable structure. And finally, to select again a few industries, the same ones actually, and maybe one or two more: tobacco products, automobiles, and maybe one or two more, and put a higher rate of 25% on them. That should make it give you the revenues. It will be raise the buoyancy. So a simplified structure which takes care of efficiency, equity, and revenues. And you'll see how the buoyancy increases and how the MSMEs prosper under the system. So this is the one I've been recommending. Well, maybe it will happen in 5 years, maybe in 10 years. The second, there was another question, sorry.
That's it. I want to thank you for your time. I wanted to also ask you more on malnutrition, but you have explained while you were explaining about the UID. So I think that gives a bigger picture to us. So really thank you for such a illuminating talk and a learning experience for all of us. We could see that very quickly you get into the professional mode of explaining the rationale behind it. But as a policymaker, that is obvious that happens when you
convince a lot of people, a lot of vested interests. I fought the vested interests. The people above just give the order. I was in the trenches.
Exactly. And once once you've worked in the trenches and you've like the unsung hero is not really impacted by the daily things, but then you are working consistently, persistently, and providing the backbone to all the reforms. So it was very interesting to listen to this unadulterated the story of reforms, past, present, and then how do we project it in the future. And thank you very much for your time and putting all this together. I have a very important, very good announcement to make that today's lecture will be available tomorrow by noon on our website. I'm sure this is going to be used by many policymakers, academicians, and researchers. Also, next week.
Sharon, can I make a suggestion? Maybe the PowerPoint can also be put on EGROW website in case people want to download it directly.
Sure. I'm sure we'll do that because your first slide is so important and your concluding slide is so important, and the way you made it into phases, and some of these phases are so apparent. So I think it's very important that we put the PowerPoint. Thank you for giving us that permission. We will do that. Next week, we are having Dr. Rakesh Mohan present to the audience, and Dr. Arvind Virmani will be the discussant, chairing the session, and of course, serving as a discussant to that presentation. So we continue our journey on reforms, and week after that, we'll have something on potential, which Dr. Nitin Dev Gupta was asking. We are going to bring a young speaker from the International Monetary Fund who has worked on potential and the potential of the innovation, potential of the population, bring us that. And week after that, we have Professor Geeta Kingdon speaking to us on education. So we have a lineup of very good speakers for the next three Fridays. We would invite all of you to please mark your calendar and join us. With that, let me thank Dr. Virmani on behalf of all of you once again, on my behalf, as well as all of us thankful that you have told us the journey, the story, I would say the untold, unknown story of reforms, which we would have never had known earlier. You've given us a peep into how policy making takes place, how it all started with the Planning Commission's division, development policy, and how the continuity that you were working at the World Bank came into Planning Commission and then transited into the Ministry of Finance and worked in the trenches to provide these notes and provide backbone to the reforms, which would have been untold and not heard. So thanks for all that. Let me thank the participants for enriching this discussion today. With that, thank you and see you all next Friday with another round of discussion on reforms. Thank you.